Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Berman Hour. My name is Jeff Berman. It's good to be with you on a Sunday. And today my guest is an old college roommate of mine who's been doing some very interesting things. I'm very excited about this. I'm going to get him in here right now. Mr. Joseph O'Sullivan at Speed the Pilgrim. All right. Hey. How
Jeffrey,
are you? How are you?
I'm excellent. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Can you see and hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me down in my
I,
coronavirus bunker in Olympia,
yeah, I can
Washington?
hear you all. I can hear you fine. I can hear you fine. It's good to see your face. You look good. Are you just railing LaCroix like daily? You're just like,
I was just in the shower. I brought LaCroix into the shower with me.
I guess the shower beer has taken on a whole new meaning.
That's right. In many ways, I've changed, and in some ways, not so much.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I have I have so much I want to talk to you about. For those of you that are tuning in, and for those of you that will be watching later, this is Joe O'Sullivan. He's at Speed the Pilgrim on uh, the Instagram and Olympia Joe on Twitter. And he is a journalist at the Seattle Times, but he's also one of my oldest friends and a former college roommate of mine. So I want to quickly go through and talk about every single fucked up experience that we had living together in college.
Is this the Berman year? Because it's going to take a lot of time to go through those.
No, no, the occasional F bomb is okay, but I'm trying to keep the show PG or at least not incriminating to anybody's family or employers. So I
Well, then
won't
we're
get
not
into
going to have a
that.
lot to talk about here, are we?
We're not going to have a lot to talk about. But I thought of an interesting question for you. Because we were college roommates in Washington, D.C. at American University. We lived in the same dorm, and then we lived in the same house, which was a small house. It was five of us. And you're in Seattle now. I'm in Los Angeles now. Uh, in Los Angeles, obviously, celebrities are kind of everywhere, and it's a thing. But in Washington, celebrity culture is very unique. I was curious if you ever had a run-in with a Washington celebrity that was memorable for you.
Washington celebrity, I don't think about, I just don't move in the sort of circles where we run into them often, but I can think of two because I live, I cover the Capitol in Olympia. So when the
Oh, I want to talk
legislatures,
about that, but before I meant when we lived in Washington, D.C.
oh, when I lived in Washington, D.C., because I was thinking of Doug Baldwin and Chris Novoselic. Chris Novoselic comes to Olympia to testify because he's like a big, government electoral process nerd. In
Yeah,
Washington, D.C., I remember seeing John Kerry. I was in the lobby of a hotel in downtown DC. You know, the sort where there's like coffee shops and stuff.
yeah.
So I was in there grabbing coffee one day, and this would have been in 2003. I think shortly before he announced his run for president, 2003,
Oh,
2004.
wow.
And John Kerry just comes down an escalator and just goes zipping through the lobby.
Yeah.
That's the one that pops in my head offhand. What about you?
I saw Bob Dole at the World War II Memorial right before it opened, and he was giving a private tour, and I kind of snuck in. That comes to mind. I rode in the elevator. I had to go get the mayor and take him in the elevator. It was Mayor Tony Williams at the time, Anthony
Sure.
Williams.
Yeah.
It would be a cooler story if it was Marion Barry, but you know, Anthony Williams. But no, it's just interesting. Like a lot of times people they'll say something like, "Oh, so and so from the local news," or "So and so from like that guy we used to see at Babes all the time," or "So and so from the Department of the Interior," that like most people wouldn't know, but
Yeah.
as district residents we would know, and certainly as politicos we would know. Um, but like I said, you're a journalist. You write for the Seattle Times, and journalism has been a big part of your life for as long as I've known you. We were both journalism majors, but you ended up taking more of a kind of creative writing and writing path. Can you talk a little bit about your writing outside of the journalism world?
Outside of journalism, so I've been in writing fiction too for most of my adult life, probably since 24, 25 years old. And so for me, I guess when you talk about like the creative process, I just feel like sort of, writing is my vocation, and it's also the way that I communicate and the way that I connect with the world. And so I just kind of take all these things in, everything that I see and hear around me. Many times that's news, right? Due to my job and due to the experiences that I have on the job covering, breaking news and politics and big, large tragedies. I mean, you see the way the world works in all its grimy details in journalism. And then I take a lot of those things and they just kind of come into me, and then they just kind of mix around inside of me, and then they come out in different ways. It's like a puzzle. I've taken apart the real world and I reassemble it in my mind.
Interesting.
For a creative process. And that's how I write a lot of my short fiction. So I've had, short stories published in, I don't know, 5 or 6 or 7 different publications over the years. And I'm always working on other stories. And I'm always working on a novel too that never quite gets all the way done because I'm so busy doing everything else.
The elusive novel.
The elusive novel, yeah.
I think you should, once the novel comes out and it's very successful, which I'm sure it will be, you should release your book of haikus, because you had all those little notebooks of haikus.
I do, and it's funny. I used to carry, and I still carry one with me. I don't use it quite as much, but these old moleskin notebooks. I would just take notes obsessively, my 20s, throughout my 30s, and so I have a shoebox full of. There must be 15 or 20 old notebooks, and they're just full of haiku and story ideas and definitions for strange words and filthy quotes or jokes that I picked up along the way.
That's great. That's great. So we met in Washington, D.C. in college, and then academia carried you out to the Midwest in St. Paul, Minneapolis, Twin Cities. And then you started working in journalism, and it seemed like your path took some zigs and some zags. I know the places where you lived, and I've been to many of them, but I would like you to kind of give a rundown of where you lived and kind of what kind of journalism you were doing in each city that led you to now.
And by the way, it's a good friend. It's a good friend who comes to visit you when you're living in South Dakota or Wyoming or wherever. And I've always appreciated it. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I'm very grateful to have all the good friends I've had visit me in those places. But when I was 25, my father died when I was 21, and I dropped out of college for a few years, and I was screwing around, just working random jobs and stuff. And I started, as I reached my mid-20s, I started reassembling my life, and I really made some decisions all around the same time. I quit drinking. I started practicing a little bit of Buddhism, and I started thinking, I decided to sort of tear my life down to the foundations and then rebuild it from the bottom up. And I made the decision that I want to write, I want to be a writer, and I want to experience that life. And so I'm just going to do what I need to do in order to do that. And I'm going to be sort of open to the directions that it takes me in. And sure. So I went back to college in the Twin Cities, and I graduated in 2000, would have been spring of 2008. And I knew I wanted to write for newspapers. So I applied to 50 newspapers all over, big ones, small ones. I didn't have a lot of internships. I didn't have any connections in the journalism industry. And one person responded, and it was the newspaper in northeastern South Dakota, this tiny town called Watertown. It was a 6-day afternoon newspaper. This newspaper was so old school, it came out in the afternoon, which was common 50 years ago or 100 years ago today. And so that's where I went. And for me, it was a very intense and incredible experience. I mean, I grew up in New Jersey. For anyone who doesn't know, it's the most densely populated state in America. I'd lived in D.C., I'd lived in the Twin Cities, and here I was going to a town of 20,000 people. It's the biggest town within an 80-mile radius, 5th biggest city in South Dakota. It was a farm hub. And I mean, just the rural characteristics were interesting and amazing. The type of people you meet, the farmers. And of course, that's when I started covering Native American reservations too, which was something, growing up in the East Coast, very new to me, and very just Some crazy experiences. I spent 2 years there, and
just to interject real quick, a funny story that I remember you telling me once that that just made me have a good chuckle at the dinner table was you said you went to McDonald's for breakfast on a Saturday morning,
uh-huh.
and you just sat, in your booth by yourself with your tray, and you're about to dig into your Egg McMuffin, and this guy at the adjacent booth just turns his head over to you and says, "I'm a farmer. I've been a farmer all my life."
I'm a farmer. Oh, I love it.
You want to tell me about that?
I do, because this is when I was just telling someone the other day how special South Dakota is for me. I love this state. I've lived there twice. I still think about it. If I weren't living in Washington State and I were living in another state, it might well be South Dakota. But the sort of the human interactions, the human exchanges you would have there, there's not as much going on, and you're not bumping into people all day, and people there work hard, right? But they're not professional careers. You're working the land, you're doing your work, and so it's not as frantic. The pace isn't as crazy, and you're not burdened by all this ego when you're in New York or LA or Seattle. Everything's important because you're in an important place.
We're so
exactly
important.
Right. Yeah. And so you just have these great interactions with people. South Dakota bars are like the friendliest place in the world. You just walk in, and by the end of the night, you're going to be friends with everybody. And every time I'm in a bar in South Dakota, I walk to the bathroom, I'm using the urinal, and the guy next to me starts talking to me. Hey, great weather out today. It's just great stuff, funny stuff. I remember being in a bar once in Watertown, my first town, and they were having a fundraiser. If somebody has cancer or medical problem, you do a little fundraiser to help them raise expenses. And it was a cover band playing. One of the greatest music experiences of my life. Cover band playing, and they decided to play Piano Man by Billy Joel.
Yes.
But they stopped. They stopped before they played it, and they went out and they handed lyrics to everybody in the crowd, just in case nobody knew the words to Piano Man. And in South Dakota bars also, you have such a wide range of people because there's not as much stuff going on. You go to the bar on a Saturday evening. So there's kids, like 6-year-old kids running around all the way to like grandma and grandpa in their 90s. And everybody's holding on to their Piano Man lyrics, and the band starts up, and the whole 50, 60 people reading the lyrics, reading Piano Man. And just sort of experiences like that were just so unique that I'd never, that's a small experience in one sense. It's nothing amazing or anything, but yet so humane at the same time, and just such a good experience.
And where did you end up after South Dakota, after Watertown, South Dakota?
So I was looking to move up to a bigger paper, a little more money, and get a little different experience. So I came up in journalism the old way. I didn't do a lot of big internships or anything. So you just move around. You work your way up from smaller papers to bigger papers. And I applied all these papers. And I heard back from the Casper Star-Tribune in Wyoming, smallest state by population in America, one of the most rural states, one of the most beautiful states and interesting. It's like its own country and so isolated. Yeah. So I spent a year in Casper, Wyoming, which, just like South Dakota, if you'd asked me 6 months before I moved to South Dakota if I would ever live there, I'd say you're crazy. And the same thing with Wyoming.
Yeah, so Wyoming's a special place.
It is. You've spent some time there. What's your observation?
I really love it. Yeah, it's one of my favorite places to tour through.
It's
even though it's always strange. There's always a caveat of strangeness. But
it's very strange, and it's very different if you're an outsider there. And Wyoming, and you may know this, I don't know how much you know. Wyoming it's an oil state. It's an energy state. Oil, coal. It's a boom-bust state. And so what happens is they can often be very wary of outsiders because if you live in Wyoming, you've lived there for 4 generations probably. And then, the young guys come in for the coal jobs and the oil jobs, and you get drugs and crime sometimes. And then the bust goes away and all those people that came into your state and cared about it for a moment, leave.
Yeah.
So they're always a little skeptical of outsiders there.
Yeah. I have good memories of multiple times I've been to the same, I think it might be the only place I've ever eaten in Casper, but there's a diner out near one of the venues I played a couple times. I think you and I went there together once. But
I'm sure we did, yeah.
So from Casper, then that led you to the Pacific Northwest.
At that point, I was starting to figure out that I really loved the West. Even in Minnesota, when I left the East Coast, it amazed me how you could get 30 minutes outside of Minneapolis and be in the middle of nowhere. And those wide open spaces really blew my mind. And the same in South Dakota and the same in Wyoming. And the West has its own special culture too, which I found really interesting. And but as a writer, I'd done a few years now in daily newspapers, and I was looking to do longer pieces, more in-depth journalism, focus a little more on writing. And so I applied and was able to get a job at the Alternative Weekly newspaper in Spokane, Washington. And so this was the first time I lived in Washington State, out in Spokane, which is the strangest place I've ever lived, and one of the most interesting. It's just fascinating there. If anybody's ever seen David Lynch's Blue Velvet is set in Spokane, and David Lynch lived in Spokane when he was young. He grew up in Missoula, Montana.
Okay.
There's still a bar in Spokane called The Swamp that's still there, and that's a place where David Lynch hung out early in his life a little bit. And so that was my first experience sort of in the far West here.
Yeah.
And then I went back to South Dakota for a year and a half to Rapid City in western South Dakota.
Well, that's right. And then,
yeah.
And then that ultimately led you now to
Olympia, Washington.
To Olympia for the Seattle Times. So what exactly is a Capitol correspondent? What does that entail?
So the State House reporter, we're a rare and vanishing breed. We cover all the boring politics that sometimes people don't always think about, right? Everybody usually knows their mayor, they know the president, maybe they know Congress a little bit. But a lot of the most important decisions are made at the state level, state government, your state lawmakers, state senators, state representatives, governor. And so I cover all of these things. In Washington State, we have 147 state lawmakers. We have 9 statewide elected officials, from governor to attorney general to secretary of state, who oversees elections and business registration. We have a commissioner of public lands, because we have a lot of public lands out here in Washington State, from wildfires or rainforests in the west to wildfire-prone scrub brush in the east. And so my job is to not only report the news, but really to dig deeper and hold these people in power accountable and make sure they're making good decisions that are in the public interest.
Yeah. All eyes were on Seattle initially during the COVID-19 outbreak, because at the time it was believed that area was the first to be hit with it. We know now that was not the case, and it was kind of happening everywhere, or certainly in population hubs.
Yeah.
But there was a period of time where I was getting my news. I was so distraught and kind of scared, quite frankly, of reading the Washington Post or my traditional news sources, that I was getting my news from you. And your outlook on what was happening was rather bleak, to the point where I was, as a friend, just kind of concerned for you.
Sure.
How has that transitioned? How are you doing? And aside from everything that we know now, what are hopefully some good things that you've seen from just the citizens of Olympia and Seattle that, if you've seen a corner that's been turned, I would just like to hear a little bit more about that, in addition to your thoughts and experiences.
I guess first question, it was certainly the craziest. The last 2 months has been the craziest 2 months of my life with the crush of news, as we tried to keep up with just this wave of news that was so intense as the pandemic was sort of discovered. First of all, we had the first deaths reported in Seattle on February 29th, and that changed everything. And then trying to figure out, what is the virus doing? Where is it? Are state officials prepared? Are they responding correctly? Is the federal government helping? Who's doing what? And in the meanwhile, in the meantime, the virus was being detected everywhere, in nursing homes and assisted living centers, and then more counties, and spreading across the state. And really, what happened here, sort of the experience happened here first, and then sort of happened everywhere else after. Even though, as you said, it's clear now it had been kind of spreading silently everywhere at the beginning. It is strange, because it feels like we've settled into sort of a rhythm with the coronavirus in society, where people are sort of locked down. Some people don't like it, and want to start back up right away, everything. Other people don't want to start back up at all right now. They don't feel safe. So it's from a societal perspective, it's a little strange to see because the virus is almost like a weird Rorschach test. I mean, everybody sort of sees what they want in it, but it's going to do what it does regardless. And so certainly you see sort of the difficulty for anybody, any government in America, a state government, and the federal government trying to respond to it. As far as a corner being turned, I mean, I'm not super optimistic about that. I'm one of the believers that as you look at everything, you sort of have to mentally prepare that this will be another 18 to 24 months. I don't know if that's the case at all. Maybe it goes away and it doesn't come back, and that's fine. And that'll be a pleasant surprise, certainly. That would be fantastic. But I think that, you know, even as you look at the states, you know, it's going to be hard to sort of contain this. Washington State, we've done a pretty good job at this point. Oregon, south of us, has been pretty lucky, and they've kept their cases down. California, for such a big state, managed to do a pretty big job. But when you talk about something that's as widespread as this, it's not just about us, right? If Georgia and South Carolina are back open for business and their people want to fly out and cough on you when you're in the record store, when you guys are back open there, I mean, that's the sort of stuff that can happen. And we really don't know if that'll happen, to what extent it'll happen, if outbreaks will continue to ping pong back and forth, but it seems like that's the case.
Yeah. What is your, you've been covering, if not for the paper, just kind of personally, you're the first person I've interviewed that lives in a capital city where all of these protests are happening. And
I was at the one yesterday.
You've been documenting that on your personal social media. What is the sense that you get from those citizens as you're walking through and amongst those rallies?
Well, I guess I'll start off by saying, if you know, for anybody that's following this, you've seen in a lot of other state capitals, there's talk about sort of people coordinating these rallies to, you know, sort of helping orchestrate them and fund them. Yeah. That's not the case in Washington State. In Washington State, we have a very long sort of liberty, sort of anti-government, sometimes secessionist movement.
Yeah.
So my observations is that these rallies are similar. They're not the same, but they're pretty similar to gun rights rallies we were having last year and the year before, right? Because we've had a very strong gun rights movement in Washington State in the last few years as the state has passed and voters have approved more restrictions on firearms. So this feels like a sort of a continuation of that. That said, there has been sort of a building sentiment in recent years in the Pacific Northwest. We have this sort of wave up and down of anti-government activity. And you can look, you know, over the decades, Ruby Ridge up in northern Idaho, the Malheur occupation, right? The Bundy occupation in 2014 in Nevada. And so it seems like the pitch is rising again a little bit. So that is, when I walk around, I mean, that's what I think about. It's a strange mix of people. There are people there that are genuinely concerned. They're small business owners and they've been shut down for 2 months and they're worried about that. Or they're workers that haven't been allowed to work and they're worried that, you know, they want to get back to work. There are also people that don't believe that, you know, they think the virus is a hoax, right? There are people who think Bill Gates is somehow, you know, leading a conspiracy.
So I guess that's what I was getting at. I was curious if you were finding kind of one type of citizen, or if you were finding kind of a spectrum of people.
It's a whole spectrum. It's a whole spectrum from sort of, you know, people with earnest concerns to people who just want to protest. I was standing in the rally yesterday behind a gentleman, head-to-toe camo, full face covering, semi-automatic rifle, and he had a Nordic ruin symbol on the back of his uniform, which has been one that's been adopted by neo-Nazis lately. He also had a straight pride patch too. Straight pride, that was his thing. So you get those types there too, because we, you know, out in the Pacific Northwest, we have hippies, we have Nazis. It's a strange situation.
Yeah, it's a weird mix up there. And that guy he's obviously a homosexual. you know, if he's going to go to that extreme. Yeah, probably. Well, I just have one more question. This
Sure.
has been really fascinating, and thanks for all this information.
Yeah.
Again, this is Joe O'Sullivan. He's a journalist at the Seattle Times. He may or may not live in Olympia, Washington. Maybe he's remote from Manahawkin, New Jersey, or Rapid City, South Dakota. But you were the first person that I met in my life, freshman year of college, that was all about ska. Now, I knew people that liked ska. I knew people that played in ska bands, but I had never met such a ska mark, a ska stan, as it were, as when I met you. So why ska, and what's your relationship to it now as you're approaching your early 40s as opposed to when you were a teenager?
The big sound from the tiny island. If you're a person that thinks about the world, that's curious about the world, I want you to think about ska for a minute. Put Real Big Fish aside, or whatever you've heard on the radio, and go back to Jamaica, the late 1950s, the early 1960s. You've got a nation that's been repressed for hundreds of years, and they're declaring independence from Britain. And they've got all these great, you know, if you love music, when you think about the music, you've got these great tribal, sort of Afro-Caribbean rhythms on the background. And this is, of course, the same time as bebop jazz is happening, this great jazz music. And so they're taking these different types of music and they're fusing it together. And then you've got, from New Orleans, you could hear that you could get some of the low-wave radio stations from New Orleans, you could get down in Jamaica. So they're hearing what's on the radio, soul music and doo-wop, right? Vocals like that, sort of gospel harmonies. And they're fusing all this music together and they're making great dance music that is also a music about unity and liberation and togetherness. And of course that kind of eventually sort of evolves into reggae, which is even a more spiritual message and less dancing and having fun necessarily. But those were the things that I realized I loved it. The more I listen to it, the more I listen to all those, the mix of all those things that I like. I love acoustic music. I love horns. I'm not a lyrics first person necessarily. So when I listen to music, it's the rhythms. And I've always been a person, you know, I'm a writer, so it's funny to say this, but writing is one of the most limited means of communication that we have. And I've always believed it when we lived together in our early 20s, and I believe it today, that if you find the right tenor saxophone player on the right solo, they can say more in 1 minute than a lot of writers can say an entire book about love and loss and ecstasy. And so great ska, in my mind. And again, I think largely the instrumental stuff and the more Jamaican stuff, but then it goes on, right? This lineage, when you think about it, goes to England in the second wave in the late 70s and in the 1980s and becomes, again, a working class unity, anti-racist, right?
Yeah.
And then comes into America in the 90s and the aughts. And I think the message of it and some of the music is held up very well. Some of the music doesn't hold up so well, but that's as with everything else.
It's like with everything, yeah.
It's like with everything.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thanks, man. Thank you so much. It's good to see you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to see you.
You know, we're getting ready to move to the East Coast. It's going to be strange not seeing you, you know, twice a year.
But you're going to see me when I come home.
Yes, of course. But, you know, part of the sad part about leaving California is leaving the coast, you know.
Yeah.
I've spent, you know, the last 8 years covering a lot of miles between Washington and Oregon and Nevada and California. So,
well, we're still going to drag you up here once in a while.
Yeah, I'm still going to try to get up there once in a while. It won't be as easy, but it'll be doable. But thanks for coming on the Berman Hour, man. Thanks for being my friend and my roommate for.
Thank you.
You know, well, thankfully you're still not my roommate. That would be a little weird, but thanks for being my friend.
You would get old by now. It would get old.
Yeah. I think, friends for 20 years is not a problem. Roommates for 20 years might be a stretch if we were still at 4310 Brandywine. But anyway, I love you, man. It's good to see you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you tomorrow, everybody. Peace.